Shalom, shalom. Just a brother Tahu War coming at you with a quick breakdown on do we have to keep the law pertaining unto Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16. Now, a lot of Christians will go to Colossians, the second chapter, and try to say that that means that we no longer have to keep the feast days or that we can't judge them for not keeping the feast days, and that's not what that's going into. Colossians, the second chapter, is going into the religious leaders at that time trying to judge the Grecians or the Gentiles for now trying to keep the feast days that at one point in time they had to be separated from. All right, we're going to break that down. Right, Colossians chapter 2, I'm going to start at verse 12. Right, I'm going to start at verse 11. And it says, in whom also ye are circumcised. Because remember, the issue in a lot of these churches was not being circumcised. Right? And if you weren't circumcised, you would be cut off. You couldn't be a part of certain religious feast days like the Passover. If you weren't circumcised, you couldn't keep the Passover. Right? When we read in Genesis, the 17th chapter, I'm going to go to Genesis 17 real fast, right in verse 14. It says, and the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. Right? So the people that weren't circumcised, they were ostracized. You weren't allowed to be around. You weren't allowed to partake. You weren't allowed to be a part of the commonwealth of Israel. So what Paul is going into in Colossians, the second chapter, is the circumcision, but it's not the physical circumcision. It's the circumcision of the heart, which justifies you, right, through Yahushua, to still be a part of Israel, the commonwealth of Israel, and the feast days that you were once separated from. Right, Colossians chapter 2, I'm going to start at verse 11 again. It says, in whom ye are, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, and putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Hamashiach. Right? Buried with him in baptism. Meaning this, if you committed certain crimes against the Most High, you had to pay for those crimes, regardless of what the crime is. Sometimes it was death. Sometimes it was your best bullock. Right? Sometimes it was just different sacrifices that you had to do for the Most High. Right? But let's use a modern day understanding of what was going on in biblical times. Right? Because you understand that a law system is a law system, regardless of who it's under. Now, in America, imagine if you commit certain crimes in America. You have to pay for these crimes. Now, what not a lot of people, but what some people would do is that they would fake their death. And when you fake your death, now the person that you were is deceased. You can no longer be judged according to the law. Right? That alias that you had, which was John Doe, no longer has to serve in prison for the rest of his life because John Doe is now dead. But the new version of you, which this new life that you done took on after you faked your death, right, is allowed to live whatever life that he wants to. He might go to Punta Cana, Mexico, etc. Right? So it's the same way with being buried with Yahushua. Right? When we're buried with him in baptism, the John Doe that you were, all of the sins get buried with him, meaning that we can no longer charge this person. Now your name might be Tahu Ward, might be Tazama, might be Makwas. Right? Makwas isn't guilty of these different sins. He's not guilty of these different crimes. John Doe was. So while John Doe is the one that's supposed to be persecuted, that's why John Doe had to be laid to rest and he had to die so that now this new manner of man that you are might live. Right? And this new manner of man is circumcised, but with the circumcision of the heart. Right? So verse 12 again, it says, buried with him in baptism, wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead. So it's saying that with him you are now rose, but you rose a different person. Now you're a new person. And this new alias that you go by is no longer being chased down by the law, by the crimes that you had committed against the government at that time. Right? Reading on, verse 13. It says, and you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all your trespasses. Right? Meaning that all of the crimes that you had committed, you now get a pardon with as this new person. You're no longer guilty of these different things. The law is no longer holding it against you. Sometimes the law is not just talking about the law as in the written law, but it's talking about the law enforcing agency, which at that time point was the Levites, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, because they were the ones that were going to come after you if you had committed certain sins. Right? Reading on. Right? Verse 14. It says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. We read Genesis the 17th to 14th chapter, right? If you weren't circumcised, then you got cut off from your people. You were no longer allowed around, right? And that was at the time of Abraham. That still was in effect at the time of Israel. You can read in Nehemiah when the children got put away. Let me get a precept real fast, right? In Numbers chapter 9, right? Numbers chapter 9, and I'm going to start at verse 13. It says, but the man that is clean, so I'm going to start at verse 12, right? It says, they shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey and forbeareth to keep the Passover, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people. Because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season, that man shall bear his sin. Right? So if you don't go and keep the Passover, you're cooked. Right? You're cooked. You cut off from Israel. We casting you out. You ain't got nothing to do with anything that we got going on anymore. Now, the people that were in Colossus are the seed of those people that were cut off for these different trespasses, whether that was during the time of the Maccabees, during the time of Nehemiah, right, under the Samaritans. These are the descendants of those people, because you wouldn't just get kicked off, you and your whole family, right? Y'all all had to go, right? And all of your seed line were now no longer going to the hospice of being Israel, but you would be, a Colossian, a Greek, a Roman. Whatever nation that you joined yourself to, you will become those people, and you will start to keep their traditions and their ways, right? But when Yahushua died, you were no longer guilty of these different things, right? You were allowed a second chance. And with this second chance, you can come back and keep the feast days that your parents were banned from keeping, right? Going back to Colossians, the 2nd chapter. It says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, right? And they try to go to this and say that this is talking about the law. Thou shalt not commit adultery is not contrary towards us. But what is contrary towards us is being killed for committing adultery, right? It's the consequences of the law, the carnality, the punishments that come with breaking the law. Like, keeping Passover isn't contrary against us, or keeping a Sabbath day isn't contrary against us. But if we break these different ordinances and you're guilty, then being put to death or being cast off from Israel are the ordinances that are contrary to us, right? So it's talking about repercussions that come with breaking these different commandments, right? And it says, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Meaning that when Yahushua died, these different ordinances died as well, right? When they were nailed to the cross, when he was nailed to the cross, these different ordinances and these repercussions that was against us were also nailed to the cross, right? And as well as those being nailed to the cross, you were now nailed to the cross, and you being dead, risen with Yahushua to now no longer be guilty of these different sins that either you or your ancestors might have committed against the Most High, right? And against the nation, right? It says, verse 15, and having spoiled the principalities and powers. You got to understand who the principalities and powers are at this time. Look at the precept real fast in Acts 23. Right? In Acts the 23rd chapter, it's all about Paul having court against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Taking him to court, and I believe the scribes were there too, right? In judgment, right? It's the book of Acts, chapter 23, right? And I'm going to start at verse number 3. It says, then Paul said unto him, Slakia, verse 2, it says, and the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law. Right? So the high priest had the men that were standing next to Paul to kind of, jaw him on the chin. Right? Jumping down, verse 6, it says, verse 5, so like it says, then said Paul, I was not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope of the resurrection of the dead am I called in question. Right? So going back to it, the principalities and the powers at that time are talking about the leadership, right? It's talking about the Pharisees, it's talking about the Sadducees, the scribes, the Levites, the high priests, the different wicked men that were in authority at that time, right? Verse number 16. So like in verse 15, read verse 15 again. It says, and having spoiled principalities and powers. This is talking about Yahushua debating them, right? Which is why it says he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Who was he triumphing over? He gonna say he was triumphing over the law, over the commandments, over thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. That's not who Yahushua was out debating and triumphing over. Look at a precept real fast, right? I'm gonna go to Luke chapter 20. Right? Luke chapter 20. Right, my point is in 8, where I'm gonna start at verse number 3. It says, and he answered and said unto them, I will also ask. No, I gotta start at verse 1. No, I'm gonna start at verse 2. Right? Now I'm gonna start at verse 1. It says, and it came to pass that on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes came upon him with the elders and spake unto him, saying, tell us, by what authority doest thou these things? Or who is he that gave thee this authority? And he answered and said unto them, I will also ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of men? And they reasoned with themselves, saying, if we shall say from heaven, he will say, why then believe ye him not? Right? Because John had put the stamp on Yahushua that he was the Messiah to come. Right? And it says, but if we say of men, all the people will stone us, for they be persuaded that John was a prophet. So Yahushua put them in a Montezarium, between a rock and a hard place. Right? And they knowing, man, we can't answer this question because I know where he's gonna go. So they just sitting there confounded. Don't want to answer because they know they tripped and caught up. Right? And it says, and they answered and said that they could not tell whence it was. And Yahushua said unto them, neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. Then he spake, then began he to speak to the people this parable. Right? And then he did a whole parable on the Sadducees and the Pharisees. When you drop down to verse 19, it says, and the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him, and they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. They like, man, I know he's talking about us. We got to do something to him, man. Right? But they afraid of the people. Yahushua was debating and confounding the Sadducees and the Pharisees, man, and the religious elders at that time. Right? So when we read in Colossians, the 2nd chapter, the principalities that were being spoiled is talking about the chief rulers that were getting on the people for not being uncircumcised, but being cut off, like, nah, yeah, you can't come and keep these feast days. You can't do this. You can't do that. Right? We get another precept real fast. It's the book of Matthew, chapter 7, at verse 28. It says, and when it came to pass, when Yahushua had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So you got the people down in the scribes, like, man, he teach better than the scribes, man. Right? His breakdowns make more sense than the scribes. He doing more work than the scribes. He teaching as if he got authority. Scribes don't teach like that. Right? So Yahushua is going around confounding the religious leaders at that time, right? Making a triumphant over them, and he doing it openly in front of everybody. Right? And Yahushua did this not only for the children of Israel, right, that were subject unto the Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, and the elders, but him triumphant over them showed that there was a new sheriff in town, right? And what I teach is the new order of things, which is why verse 16 says this: let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an high holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. Meaning this: the people that are judging you are the same exact people that Yahushua defeated in order for you to be let back in. Meaning that because you're now a new man, don't allow them to tell you that you can't keep the Passover, because now you're circumcised in the heart. They can't say you ain't circumcised. Don't tell them you can't keep the Sabbath days. Don't let them tell you you can't come into the synagogues. Don't listen to any of the things that they telling you, man. Right? Because the person that wasn't allowed to these different things is now dead with Yahushua. He's in the grave with Yahushua. But this new manner of man and woman that you are, he's allowed to come to these different things. He was circumcised. He repented. Not even just repented. He didn't have nothing to repent from, because you're a completely new man. Right? So don't allow these men to tell you the things that you cannot do, when Yahushua, who died for you, allowed you to do these things. He died so that you can die and be risen again as a new man and in a new image, the same way that he was. Right? It says, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Hamashiach. Right? So when it says which are a shadow of the things to come, meaning this: in the kingdom of heaven, all of Israel are going to be able to keep the feast days. All of Israel is going to be keeping the Sabbath. All of the nation of Israel is going to be keeping atonement, Passover, and etc. Right? But the body is of Hamashiach Yahushua. Right? Because we are the body of Yahushua. And we keeping the feast days now in captivity, and this is what he's breaking down to them in the church of Colossus, us keeping these feast days in captivity, being the body of Yahushua, are a shadow of what the kingdom of heaven is going to look like. Because you got all of these people who were imperfect, and because they were imperfect, they had to die. Now, they died spiritually and were risen with Yahushua. Right? But we understand that there's going to be an amount of Israel that are going to have to die physically. But when they're risen again, they're going to be keeping the same exact feast days that they were allowed not to keep in the old world. Right? But that's the breakdown of Colossians chapter 2 and verse number 16. Right? Stay girded. Shalom.